Hello and welcome to the Wholistically PsychEd podcast. I'm your host, Mariah Choate, a nationally certified school psychologist turned stay-at-home mom who now has the freedom to share what school districts don't want you to know after spending over a decade in the field of education. My goal is to help you learn all you need to know about special education that districts often gatekeep. Each episode will dive into how commonly laws are blatantly broken and tips on leveraging special education law to support best practice for students and teachers alike. We'll also feature interviews with parents and educators who are navigating these challenges head-on, along with those who are making strides to improve this broken system. This channel is for you, parents of students with suspected or diagnosed disabilities who already have or might need individualized education plans or 504 plans. It's also for teachers, counselors, and fellow school psychologists who are feeling the strain of a system that often leaves us feeling burnt out and overwhelmed. So if you're ready to learn, advocate, and empower yourself, child, or students, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Wholistically PsychEd podcast. I'm your host, Mariah Choate. Today, we're diving into a topic that impacted every single parent of the neurodivergent learners I personally worked with: picky eating. My guest today is a sweet friend of mine who I've gotten to know over Instagram. Klann is an occupational therapist, feeding therapist, and picky eating coach who has supported children at home and in the school settings surrounding mealtimes. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today and making the time to be a guest.
Thank you, Mariah.
All right. So first off, can you share a little bit about your background and specifically your work within autism programs in the school setting?
Yeah, so I am a pediatric occupational therapy practitioner and feeding specialist. I've worked over 10 years one-on-one with children with severe feeding challenges. They've all had sensory processing differences, picky eating challenges. I've worked with autistic children in the school-based programs where I collaborated with teachers, speech therapists, and families to help them create individualized plans that supported their feeding skills, self-regulation, sensory regulation, participation in meal times, and really their independence with their everyday skills. In the schools, in the autism program, I worked with a variety of students who had a range of feeding challenges. So those who it might have looked like struggled with textures, to those who had very strong aversions that made eating at school overwhelming for them. And even though this program was an ABA program, I still had a very sensory informed and play-based foundation to help them build comfort and confidence with food in a way that felt safe for them.
Actually, I didn't realize that it was like an ABA program. So that's really nice that you had that background because a lot of practitioners in that specific realm, I'm sure you're familiar with the like love-hate relationship with ABA, but I'm glad that you had a more holistic approach to that. That's really nice.
Yeah, so I worked in the ABA program, and then I actually interned at the Floor Time Center, which is in Bethesda. I don't know if you're familiar with floor time therapy, but it's basically the opposite of ABA. So you're following like the child's interest. And so working at the Floor Time Center was amazing to see the practitioners follow the child's lead and help them expand their play.
Hmm.
So definitely working in like a variety of places definitely helped me tailor and be able to like connect with the kids more and kind of tailor my approach to each child.
Yeah, I had no idea. I've never heard of that center either. Many people assume that eating is just a simple act for kids and they're just gonna learn it really easily. Can you walk us through the various steps involved in eating and why each step is so important?
Absolutely. So, yes, a lot of people just think, well, you just sit down and you pick up the food and you put it in your mouth. The woman who actually developed this, it's called the SOS approach to feeding. She came up with the 32 steps. Her name is Dr. K. Toomey. And some children who are neurodivergent actually go back and forth up the steps and they need to repeat it. So for them, if a child is neurodivergent, it might actually be more than 32 steps, which is really interesting. So the first steps to eating would be actually just being in the same room as a food. And I've worked with some kids that their parents would be cooking chicken and they can't even like be in the same room as the chicken being prepared or like see it. And then the last step would be obviously eating the food. So there's so many things to take into account, like the visually tolerating the food, smelling the food, like touching the food. And a child really has to be able to do all of those things before they feel comfortable bringing it close to their mouth. There's a lot that goes into it, and all of our senses all have to kind of collaborate and come together at the same time every time you chew a piece of food because the food changes in your mouth. So your brain has to like recalibrate all of the senses and what it's processing. So it's
Mm.
not just the simple one step thing that's happening. All of your senses have to be balanced in your sensory system.
Yeah, that's so wild. 32 steps and potentially more for neurodivergent learners. When I think of neurodivergence, right, I'm thinking of kids that are autistic, kids that have like sensory overload, kids that
Mhm.
maybe have attention difficulties, ADHD, emotional regulation, right? Like learners that are, in my opinion, their senses are almost like at their max already. And then you're introducing them to something new or something squishy or something stinky. Yeah, that's so interesting. So, how do you explain that eating isn't just about food intake, but it actually involves a whole system of sensory and motor processes?
So we kind of went into this a little bit, but it, our body has to coordinate all of the different systems. So our sensory processing, oral motor skills, postural control, emotional regulation. The child has to process how it looks, smells, the texture, the temperature of the food, while also coordinating their tongue, jaw movements, swallowing, chewing safely. And for some kids, especially those who are neurodivergent, the sensory and motor coordination can be overwhelming. And so it can feel wrong in their mouth or it smells too strong. And their brain might think that this is like something dangerous and it's not supposed to be this way, which can lead to refusal. So feeding is never just about, just being a picky eater. There's always something under it or a skill that's missing or something that's difficult for that child or their brain, how their brain is processing it that we need to get to. So the picky eating might just look like the symptom, but we're really trying
Mm.
to get to what's that missing skill that we need to teach them.
That's a good way of thinking about it. If you're dealing with picky eating, that's a symptom of something else that might be going on a deeper level. I think that's really good to keep in mind for sure.
It kind of like reframes it for you, right? It makes you feel like it's not your fault. Like I know a lot of parents are like, I caused this. Like they feel a lot of guilt that their child isn't progressing or eating like they quote unquote should be. So I think when you think about it from this standpoint, it kind of helps you understand and you're able to be more empathetic towards them, kind of look at it from the perspective of he's not giving me a hard time. He's just having a hard time with something, and we have to figure out what that is.
I love that reframe. He's not giving me a hard time, he's having a hard time. Oh my gosh, that's so true. So, in your experience, what are some common sensory challenges or causes that might be underlying that would contribute to picky eating or feeding difficulties?
So, some common challenges are tactile sensitivities, where a child dislikes the sticky food or the mushy, slimy food because it looks very overwhelming or it's overwhelming in their hands or their mouth. They can have oral motor challenges where they have the weak tongue or jaw muscles, which makes it hard to chew or leads to avoidance because they don't know how to move it around in their mouth. They can have challenges with interoception where they might not recognize their hunger cues or feel full easily, which leads to like the unpredictable eating patterns. And then a lot of autistic children are very routinely rigid. So they thrive on predictability. And so trying new foods can feel stressful when it disrupts their routine or it looks different. And sometimes we say that they're like drive-by feeders where they'll like look at the corner of their eye and they'll look at the food but not really like interact with it. They're just like making sure it looks a specific way, and if it's like a tiny bit different, they like won't interact with it because it doesn't look familiar to them.
Hmm. So that, like,
Yeah.
in my mind, that would totally cancel out like fruit, right? So like if you have berries, all of them might
Mhm.
look different in the carton. Some of them are going to be more firm or more sweet, and some are more sour, more squishy. So, and
Mhm.
like that happens with all fruit. So really you're talking about a lot of processed foods, right? That would look similar.
Yeah, so that's what we see. A lot of kids usually get stuck on the goldfish that look exactly the same. Um, and all of the crackers, the puffs that are the same. The puffs are even easier because they kind of melt in your mouth. So that's even they have to do less work.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's when they can kind of get stuck. But it's really interesting because there's no like one general food that every picky eater likes because
Mm-hmm.
every child's sensory system is so different. There are some children that only like the mushy food and some that very much dislike the mushy food, some that really like the crunchy food and some that don't like the crunchy food. It's very interesting that I mean it makes sense when you know about the sensory system and how all of our
Right.
bodies are different, but it's fascinating.
So parents are usually at the front line of supporting their children at home. So in what ways are parents uniquely positioned to help their children overcome these eating challenges?
You, as a parent, are perfectly positioned to help your child because you are their safe space. You know their triggers, preferences, rhythms better than everyone. And you're also present for their daily meals. I know when they get to go to school, you're not there for lunch, but usually there's at least one meal. If it's not breakfast, if you're running out the door at breakfast, at least it's dinner where you can all sit and have a meal together and really model what you want them to be doing at mealtime. You help them create like a calm mealtime environment, allow food exploration without the pressure, and model enjoyment of food. You also set the emotional tone at the table. So when you're regulated, our child can feel that when we're anxious about how many bites they're going to take and that we're nervous about them, starting solids and gagging, they can feel our emotional tone as well. And a lot of what I saw in the clinic, this was like the missing piece where children would try all of the food in the clinic, but they were unable to carry it over at home, which led me into the coaching because that's really where we want to see kids eating their food because they're not going to be at therapy every day. They're going to be at therapy, 1.5 hour a week. And we really need them consistently eating at home.
Hmm.
So, for specifically those autistic and neurodivergent children who need to have that familiar routine, it's easier to carry it over in a familiar environment than going back and forth because transferring those skills is really difficult.
So even when they're having one 30-minute session a week, you're saying they were eating more food and being more consistent than even when they were at home, just in that 30 minutes? That's
Yes.
wild.
So they would try a ton of foods. I mean, not all of them. A lot of my clients would start it in the clinic and then the parents would carry it over at home. But some parents did have difficulty transitioning and sitting
Hmm.
down with their kids and carrying over those skills at home.
Even in a short session like that, that's so crazy to me. Speaking of like the real life home setting, so could you discuss why you believe parental involvement might be the missing link or bridging the gap between the clinical recommendations and the real life home setting, similar to what you're talking about?
Yes. So I think that having children in their natural environment really is going to really helps make the best progress and carry over because we don't ideally, I think every therapist will tell you we don't want to see your child in therapy forever, right? We want to teach you the skills and then we want you to graduate and be able to transfer those skills to like other environments. So the goal is always to have them at home eating in their natural environment. And we need to help parents carry over those strategies because they're going to be the ones sitting and having meals with their kids. right? We don't want them to only be able to eat with therapists in the clinic. We need to like empower the parents and give them the tools to help reduce the stress at home and support ongoing food exploration to help kind of bridge that gap. And that was like a huge missing piece. The parents needed confidence and they needed to know how to do it in their own home and how to set up the environment and how to carry over those strategies.
I think of like similar to when my son was doing physical therapy, like he had to wear a helmet for a period of time. And I just think of myself, like if I didn't have the tools, the confidence, the like support to know how to do those stretches at home, how to continue the consistency, making sure he's like on a similar routine or like doing tummy time a certain amount of time, doing the stretches, doing the movements, like if I didn't know and he was just doing that when he was in physical therapy, like there wouldn't be nearly as much progress, right? Because he
Mhm.
was only doing PT like once a week. So yeah, that's very interesting. I definitely agree, like empowering the parent because they're with their children in the home setting much more often than school or clinical setting. All right, so how can integrating play and a child's personal interest into mealtime routines actually help neurodivergent children overcome these feeding challenges?
Oh, this is my favorite part. I just love connecting with the child and using their interests to get them interested in food. It is like the key to helping them expand their diet. Connecting with them is like this little glimmer into their world. And then when you can use that passion and their interest, even if you're like, my child has no interest, he just lines up food, that you can carry over to the table and line up different foods and then pretend it's a train or that the little people or food are waiting to be knocked down. Like, it's so fun. You see their face light up because you're doing something that they like to do, and it helps them engage with the food. And sometimes they don't even realize what they're doing, that they're like touching the food that they never touched before, or that they're smelling a food that they never smelled before, or that they licked a food that they never would have wanted to if you said, "Here, take a lick." But if you
Mm-hmm.
make it something fun and pretend it's like a lollipop or a dog bone that they can hold in their mouth instead of like a boring carrot, they just they just want to do it because it's part of their play and it's helping them learn about the food. It's making it less intimidating. It's bringing that joy back to the mealtime, which is another huge piece that is often something that we need to work on because with all of like the pressure around meals, they start to turn negative. So bringing
Mm.
like the joy back kind of resets the whole dynamic around meals when they're starting to learn about new food again.
I love that. Like resetting the dynamic. Like I think of me growing up, like it was normal to be like, oh, we're at the kitchen table, we're sitting quietly, like our
Mhm.
hands are still, we're waiting for our food, we're finishing our plate, like all of these like pressures that you don't really realize like as a kid. But as you get older, I think it just becomes part of like what you pass down of like, okay, when we're at the table, we need to make sure we have a calm body. We need to make sure we finish our food. And it's like, oh my gosh, where did those pressures come from? Who created them? Why are we passing them on? Like, why can't we have joy and play still at the table and
Mhm.
still try new foods and try new things, right? I love that. So, next question. How do strategies differ when supporting neurodivergent children in the school setting versus at home? And what are some practical tips for both environments?
Great question. So at school, it's a lot about modifying their environment, offering um, sensory strategies for positioning, and helping them with independence. It's a lot harder to work on new foods in a school setting because you're kind of limited to what the parents, bring in. What I do like about the school setting is that kids can learn from their peers, so they could be exposed to more food, and sometimes I would use that with the older kids, like, what do your friends have for lunch that you might wanna try? And then have it on, like, a list so you kind of know, like, oh, they're interested in trying this food. That at least gets them a little bit closer to wanting to try it or be open to learning about it. Um, And then at home, the emphasis is just having that family meal together and providing that modeling and bringing like the joy back to meals, even if it's not always eating a new food, learning about it. Um, Depending on the family and their dynamics, you can do more play with the food. Um, and then as a parent, you know their motivations, you know their play ideas. So it's a lot easier to kind of re-engage them at home in that like intimate environment at the dinner table. Like my boys, I played this sleeping monster game once to see who could crunch their broccoli the loudest, and I would pretend to sleep. And they still asked to play the
Oh
monster
my
game,
gosh,
and they like asked for more broccoli just to crunch because we air fry our broccoli.
that's funny.
So they want me to like pretend to sleep, and I'm like the tickle monster, so they know that they get like tickles after dinner if they wake the sleeping monster up.
Oh my gosh, that's so cute. Your house sounds so fun for meal times. I am curious, and I don't know if you ever get this pushback from parents. Are parents ever like tentative to try to bring play to the table? Because they're more focused on like, no, but they need to eat, but they need to like fill their belly, they need to eat enough food.
Yes. So I think saying that's like kind of the risk that you get when you say like, "Oh, play based." Their parents like, I'm not so sure about that." But I think when they learn about the 32 steps to eating and how it kind of you kind of have to do one step at a time, and play can look when I love this is why I love coaching parents because I can adapt my strategies based on the family's preferences. So if a family is very strict about like we don't want to do like too much messy play at the table, I can suggest things like, okay, well, you can, there's ways to fit it in throughout your day that's messy play that you don't have to do at the dinner table, and kind of just working what feels comfortable for them, or doing it in a way that doesn't feel like some of the suggestions are can be things like um, them taking their fork and like drawing a road with the ketchup and their chicken across their plate. So it's not like anything crazy.
Right.
So sometimes parents are a little bit more open to suggestions like that. But I really like that you can kind of tailor it to what the parents feel comfortable with.
Right. It's like so much of coaching the parent so that you can support the child, not necessarily just coaching the child on like, hey, we're trying new foods.
Yeah,
That makes
yeah.
so much sense. So, speaking of all these like options that you're sharing and like different ideas for support, can you share a success story or example where incorporating play and a child's interest actually significantly improved their eating behavior?
Yes. So when I actually made a mom happy cry
Oh,
once, she brought in her 2.5-year-old that I was seeing in therapy, and she would bring, his packed lunch like every day. And at the end of the session, she'd be like, "Okay, like how was it? What did he eat?" And I was like, "Oh, he ate like all his grapes," like very casually said this because I didn't ask like what he'd eaten before anything. And she started crying when she heard that he like ate his grapes. And she was like, "Well, how did you get him to do that?" I was like, "Well, I just cut them like super, super tiny, like in an eighth of pieces." And then he really liked boats, so we made them little boats and we pushed them around the table. And then they like went up our arms, and then they were on our nose, and then we gave them
that's
kisses
cute.
goodbye. And then he decided to lick it, and then he started to eat it. So and she started crying. She's like, "I never
Oh,
thought to cut them that tiny." And like, of course he loves vehicles. So like, why wouldn't he want to like play with them, make them boats? And
how
yeah,
funny.
so sometimes like small tweaks like that we think are like super tiny aren't going to make a change can make like a world of difference in the feeding dynamic.
And I can just imagine that, like, let's imagine mom was present and the whole time she's like, oh my gosh, yeah, you're about to do it. Oh, great. Right? Like, if she's like really involved instead of just kind of passively supportive and like neutral, I feel like that could make a huge difference as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So this particular mom was very involved and did carry a lot of things over this particular time when she was just not there. But she, I think, like being involved and seeing it, and that external like validation and like verbal reinforcement is really, really helpful when you're, making those new patterns. And
Right.
who doesn't want to be like appreciated and
Right. That is so
praised?
cool. That sounds so much fun. You're so creative. All right. So speaking about school teams specifically, so what advice would you give to school teams and other professionals collaborating with families to support neurodivergent children around meal times? I know you mentioned before, like the school setting is not necessarily the time or place to like introduce a ton of new foods. So what advice would you give them for the collaboration with families to support?
Yeah, so I think that any input from the parents is super helpful, like how the child acts at home, what's like their sensory profile, um, and kind of taking into consideration what the parents say and providing like supports to best allow the child to be as independent as possible in the school. So some kids need like a wiggle cushion if they're seeking that movement to be able to like sit at their desk or sit at mealtime, or like a TheraBand to kick, or more movement like throughout the day. So just a supportive, non-judgmental approach with input from the parents. And yeah, just I think getting as much input from the families as you can to kind of take into account what you're not seeing, what you may not see at school. Because I think sometimes kids will act one way at school and then different at home.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it just helps paint a better picture of the whole child when you can get input from everyone, and it's like everyone working together, which I
And
know not
probably
doesn't always happen very often.
yeah, sometimes, yeah. I think that's a huge piece though. Like I know I've worked with school teams before where like the parent and or like the teacher, paraeducator, whoever is like overseeing meal times, like have totally different standards of like parent isn't really concerned if they're eating their fruit first or eating their cookie first, like they don't really care. But yet the school team is trying to reinforce like, nope, you eat this first, then this, and then it's like a whole meltdown around meal times.
Mm.
So yeah, a huge piece is like that collaboration and support. So making sure like the standards, expectations, routine as much as possible is like consistent, I'm sure is helpful. So this conversation highlights so much of what parents and even educators don't always see. The unseen struggles of students with feeding needs and what best practice should look like at both home and at school. Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing your perspective and expertise today. Before we wrap up, can you tell us the best way to find you if we needed more support and what type of services you actually offer?
Yes. So you can find me most active on Instagram at Tiny Bite Wellness, where I share sensory friendly feeding strategies, tips for picky eaters and parents of picky eaters, and mealtime support for neurodivergent little ones. I do offer one on one coaching for parents who need personalized guidance, um, for meals and what food to serve your little ones and how to make meals enjoyable again. And I also have digital resources to help parents feel more confident in supporting their child's feeding journey. And if you're not sure where to start, I do offer a 15-minute call to see if we are a good fit.
I love that. I'll make sure to put like all your links to where to find you in the description below too. Thank you so much for tuning in to Holistically Psyched podcast. If you found today's episode insightful, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. Let's keep the conversation going about advocating for every child's needs and see you next time.
Thanks so much for joining me today. I would be so grateful if you could share this with anyone you can think of who works in education or happens to have a child with disabilities. If this was helpful for you, make sure to subscribe so you can hear some of the crazy and amazing stories of what is really going on behind the scenes in public education. Until next time, remember, in the famous words of Maya Angelou, each child belongs to all of us, and they bring us a tomorrow in direct relation to the responsibility we have shown to them.